And hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are back again, talking comic books once again. I thought today we'd talk about inking. And to butcher a question from Hamlet, to tablet or not to tablet? To Wacom or not Wacom? To Cintiq or not Cintiq? To stylus or not stylus? This has become a debate, not a formalized opinion. It used to be a formalized opinion. Now it's a debate in my head. It is a circle that is very hard to square, or a square that's very hard to circle, and it's verging on a conundrum. At the outset, if you're going to be doing 24 pages of something, or you're going to be doing more pages than that, you do not want to switch back and forth between a tablet and natural, organic, traditional inking, because they still, to this day, at least to my eyes, look significantly different, and you can always spot the difference. And I will use an analogy, not a metaphor, an analogy that all of my fellow fans of Blake 7 and Doctor Who will understand. A lot of times, you would have the stuff shot in the studio, and that would be shot on videotape. And then they would have outside scenes, exterior shots, exterior scenes. That stuff would be shot on film. And it was visually very jarring. And most people thought it was very unpleasant. Later on, you grow to kind of like it and love it. But for the most part, in a comic book, you really would not want to have that effect. So you wouldn't want to go from one 24-page issue or chapter in a graphic novel done with a Wacom or a Cintiq and then jump to traditional inking using brush and nib on Bristol board, or vice versa, because it still always is noticeably different. And there are many ways that this disparity can play out. Number one is original art working size. Before 1967, you would have an art size of 12 inches by 18 inches with a lot of extra paper to either side, top, and bottom. Then in 1967, the size got lowered to 10 inches by 15. Later on, if you were working on DC board in the late 80s or throughout the 90s, that image area and the overall size of the board was a little bit smaller still. Several years after she had done her work on Sandman, or her initial work on Sandman, I was at a convention in Artist Alley, and I was sitting next to Colleen Duran. And I thought it was interesting and strange that she was working on image sizes that were smaller still. Basically, she was working at the printed size of a comic book, or barely larger than that. She said that she always preferred to work at that size. It was the size she was most comfortable with. And I found that very surprising. But this kind of begs the question, for your comic book, do you want the inking to look like Mark Rayboy from the good old days of comic books with all that detail? Do you want it to look like Frank Frazetta and the ink work he did in science fiction? Or do you want it to look like, and I'm not coming down on the art at all, but do you want it to look like Colleen Duran? Because there always seems to be a correlation between rather coloring book outline art in the inking and a lack of rendering in the inking, a lack of feathering, a lack of cross-hatching, and a smaller page size. And it seems with everybody who was doing wonderful work like Frank Frazetta and Mark Rayboy and artists like these guys, the page size was always bigger. And a lot of those lines, particularly the outlines or the motion lines or the rendering lines, at a larger size are going to have a significantly different aesthetic and effect on the perception of the art by the reader, because at a larger size, you are not just using your fingers and thumb, you're not just using your wrist, you're not just using your elbow, sometimes you're even using a bit of your shoulder and you're getting a lot more character, and sometimes they're just smoother. They have a bit more what I would refer to as emotional input. Oh boy, I got so excited I smacked something. A more emotional impetus. I mean, if the artist or the person publishing the artist wants to have that look, that means you're going to have to be working on that large of an image size, because that's what's going to be necessary for everything past your elbow to be making those lines. And that can be challenging for a lot of us under the age of 60, because most of us started doing comic book work, so to speak, as doodles in our school books, in our notebooks, or in whatever little sketch pad we might receive from our parents or buy with whatever money we could scrape together as kids. And it became very challenging when you realized, no, the comic book art is bigger. In the physical form, you'd scale up, and sometimes that wasn't comfortable. I remember the first time I did what would be considered a full-size painting. I was not used to working at that size. It was very daunting, and it took a while to get used to it, but the painting did improve. And I started doing some comic book work at a larger size, privately, not for the big companies. I noticed a significant change, and I liked the change. But here's the problem. How do you find a tablet that is affordable, that is that big? And even in my one-horse town, and I love this town, and I wouldn't want to live in a 2-horse or a 3-horse town, trust me, particularly not during these days, I can always get the paper that big. I can always get anything that large enough, even if I have to order it for delivery, to arrive at my door, and I can work on that size. But here's where the debate part comes in. How many of those original sheets do you want? How much room do you have? And do you have a drafting table, or are you able to work, do drawings and inking on an easel, a painting easel like I can? And can that work for you as an artist? Do you have the room? Do you have the facility for it? The environment. And if you get to 100 pages of original art in traditional means of production at that size, that's taking up a hell of a lot of space, and it's a hell of a lot of weight. I mean, imagine trying to cart those original pages for sale to a convention. Wow. So even though I am an antediluvian Luddite, I really see those advantages, but there are other advantages in addition. For example, photons, electrons, zeros and ones do not change. They are constant. The quality of ink that we use to ink pages, the quality of the brushes, the quality of the nibs, those fluctuate. And sometimes they fluctuate downwards. There were a set of synthetic brushes that I used to love. On the rare occasions I would use a brush for ink work, and they were fantastic. And I enjoyed them, and I would always buy them for 2 years. Guess what? By the time we got to 2.5 years, they were not available anymore. And even just before that, the quality started going down. The points were not as good. There wasn't as much spring. They simply were not as usable. They were not as efficient. I mean, imagine suddenly you have to go to another art store and they don't have any of the brushes. They don't have any brushes that are going to work as well. And you lose 6 hours on a deadline trying to get proper new brushes, or work with ones that are not as good. And you have to worry about the editor and the fans and everybody else noticing that difference. Or you got to lose more time compensating with your hand, your wrist, your arm to adjust for that brush. And you think, okay, well, just use the nib. Well, mainly I did use nibs. And I would, for about 48 pages of inks, on one particular project for one of the big two, I was using almost entirely the Hunt 100 nib, which is very finicky but provided the exact kind of line that I needed, and a lot of comic book pros relied on it. Here's the problem. You buy a pack of 50, you buy a pack of 100, and only half of them or less are going to be the good stuff, the best stuff, and give you that exact tiny, thinnest line to thick line without buggering up that you need. There'd be at least 20 in a pack of 100, maybe more, where the lines were too thick. They'd be good for outlines and nothing else. They wouldn't have the same spring, and you'd have to waste about an hour sometimes, or half an hour at least, going through all these little nibs, preparing them properly, and I won't even go into that process, and testing them out. And of course, you'd have to test them out on the actual board you were using, provided by the company, or if it was your own board that you bought, so be it. Annoying. Don't have to deal with that with a tablet. Not to mention the actual Bristol boards themselves, which sometimes would dip in quality. Not that often, but sometimes they would, or sometimes they'd simply disappear off the market. And then came the worst of all. When certain companies that made inks that we relied on, Winsor and Newton, I'm looking at you, sometimes the consistency of the ink would change, and not only that, but the actual ingredients, the recipe would change, and something that worked beautifully in the previous year suddenly was becoming very difficult, and you'd have to modify it, and sometimes you'd have to add distilled water, and sometimes not even that would work. And guess what? With photons, electrons, zeros, and ones, and a stylus tip, you don't have to worry about that. According to everything that I hear or see from people who mainly work with a tablet, the worst you have to worry about is the tip of the stylus getting a bit worn down or getting a little bit buggy, and then you simply replace the stylus, the tip of the stylus. Sometimes you have to replace the stylus itself, but mainly it's just the tip of the stylus, and it seems like that almost never happens. Now that is efficient, and that's good for deadline. Then we get to possibly the best part. With a tablet, no scanning, no having to use a camera to photograph the art, no intermediary technological mechanical process required. You finish up the page, ready for export, ready to send to someone else for the lettering, for the coloring. What if you're in the middle of a project? What if you're working on something that's 24 pages or 48 pages or 70 pages, and you're 30 pages into it, and suddenly your camera dies or your scanner goes buggy and will not provide usable files? What do you do then except cry? These days, I think whether you are the inker or the person who is hiring the inker, those are major factors to take into account if you're going to actually do something that needs to come out at a certain time, whether that's for one of the wackadoodle, no longer really good traditional comic book companies or a crowd-funded project. But no matter what anyone chooses, it's a big commitment for anything over 30 pages. So just like shacking up with somebody, are you in love with them? Are you in love with one process or the other? That's enough for now. Catch everyone later. Happy comic book creation to you.